Mindset Tales presents Massacred for Profit, a tale of discovery, tragedy, and justice, based on actual events. I have always believed that some people are born carrying a quiet, unexplainable pull toward the natural world, as though something ancient, something older than language itself, calls to them from beyond the noise of human life. It is not something easily articulated. It's felt in the body before it is understood in the mind, a stillness that settles in the chest when the wind moves through grass, a sharpened awareness when the horizon stretches unbroken, a sense of belonging in places where humanity has left only the faintest trace, if any at all. For me, that pull was constant, an undercurrent running through every stage of my life, guiding my choices in ways I only later came to understand. And when I met Sion, I recognized that same current in her almost immediately. It wasn't something we had to explain to each other. It revealed itself in the way we moved through the world, how we lingered in silence rather than filled it, how we noticed small, easily overlooked details, how we treated wild spaces not as scenery, but as something sacred. It became one of the first quiet certainties between us, a shared reverence for ecosystems that exist beyond human design, for the fragile and often invisible balances that sustain life. So when the opportunity presented itself, a formal research project centered on a herd of blesbok, Damaliscus pygargus philipsi, inhabiting the open bushveld on a private farm just outside Pretoria, South Africa, there was no real deliberation. We accepted almost instinctively. It wasn't ambition that drove us, nor the promise of recognition or career advancement. What drew us in was something far less tangible, yet far more compelling, a deep-rooted curiosity, a sense of responsibility, and the quiet hope that, in some small way, our work might contribute to the preservation of something that could not speak for itself. From the moment we first encountered the herd, we were captivated in a way that went beyond simple fascination. They moved across the veldt like living brushstrokes, fluid, deliberate, and impossibly cohesive. Their sleek, chestnut-colored bodies caught the shifting light of the veldt, while the stark white blazes on their faces stood out with almost luminous clarity. There was a rhythm to their movement, a synchrony that felt both instinctive and deeply learned, as though each individual carried within a memory passed down through generations. Watching them was not merely an act of observation. It felt like witnessing a system in motion, an intricate, self-regulating world where every movement had meaning, every pause carried intention. Time seemed to behave differently in their presence. Hours would pass unnoticed as we studied their patterns, their interactions, their subtle communications. In those moments, it felt as though we had stepped into something rare and unspoiled, something that existed just beyond the reach of human interference. There was a sense of privilege in that, a quiet awareness that we were being allowed to witness something complete and undisturbed. But that sense of wonder, that fragile illusion of permanence, did not endure. The truth emerged not in the field, but in the sterile confines of a routine meeting with the project coordinators. It was delivered matter-of-factly, almost clinically, as though it were just another logistical detail to be acknowledged and filed away. The land on which the blesbok roamed had already been designated for development. A low-cost housing initiative, the council explained, urgent, necessary, inevitable. The language was careful, measured, designed to emphasize human need and progress. Yet beneath it lay an undeniable reality. The herd's habitat, their entire ecosystem, was living on borrowed time. At first, the weight of that revelation was difficult to fully grasp. It settled slowly, like dust in still air, before gathering into something heavier, more suffocating. The open grasslands we had come to know so intimately were no longer just a landscape, they had become a countdown. Every movement of the herd, every quiet moment we observed, was now framed by an unspoken, unavoidable deadline. We found ourselves standing at a crossroads, confronted by a choice that felt both simple and impossibly complex. We could fulfill the original terms of our work, document the herd, compile our findings, and step away when the project concluded. We could remain observers, detached and compliant, allowing the inevitable to unfold without interference. Or we could resist. Choosing the latter meant stepping beyond the safety of our roles as researchers. It meant questioning decisions already set in motion, challenging systems far larger than ourselves, and accepting the uncertainty that came with opposition. It meant risking failure. But some choices, once seen clearly, are no longer choices at all. And so, without needing to say it aloud, we made our decision. Relocating a species is never a straightforward task. Even under the best circumstances, it demands careful planning, extensive resources, and a deep understanding of the intricate relationships that bind an animal to its environment. But with Blesbok, the challenge felt far more daunting, almost insurmountable. They are not generalists that can adapt easily to shifting conditions. They are highly selective grazers, finely attuned to a narrow range of grasses that thrive only under very specific ecological circumstances. Their survival is tied not just to the presence of vegetation, but to the precise composition, nutritional value, and seasonal rhythms of those grasses. Disturb that balance, transplant them into an environment that looks suitable on the surface, but lacks the same underlying conditions, and the consequences could be devastating, even fatal. What began as a research assignment quickly transformed into something far more consuming. Our work ceased to feel like a structured project and instead became an all-encompassing pursuit, an obsession that shaped our days and occupied our thoughts long after we left the field. From first light to the fading edge of dusk, we observed the herd at a respectful distance, careful not to disturb their natural behavior. We documented everything: the routes they took across the bushveld, the subtle shifts in their habits from one grazing area to another, the duration of their feeding periods. We mapped their patterns meticulously, layering observation upon observation until the landscape itself began to feel like a living map of their decisions. We collected samples constantly, handfuls of grasses from exact spots where they fed, soil from beneath those grasses, notes on texture, color, moisture. The work was repetitive, often exhausting, and conducted under conditions that tested both patience and endurance. Often we would be in the middle of doing a herd count when something or someone would inadvertently startle a herd, causing them to run off in panic. This meant that we would either have to abandon the task or wait until the dust had settled, and then start again. There were long stretches of silence, broken only by the soft tearing of grass or the distant movement of the herd. Yet beneath that quiet was a mounting urgency. We were no longer just studying behavior, we were racing against time, acutely aware that every day lost was a day closer to irreversible change. At first, the data felt overwhelming, an accumulation of details without clear meaning. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns began to take shape. The Blesbok were not grazing indiscriminately, as one might expect from animals moving across such expansive terrain. Their choices were deliberate, almost exacting. They remained almost exclusively on certain patches of land, grazing them with focused attention, while other areas, seemingly similar to the untrained eye, were bypassed entirely. It wasn't random. It wasn't even merely habitual. There was a level of discernment in their behavior that suggested something deeper than simple instinct, a kind of inherited knowledge, or perhaps an unspoken sensitivity to variables we could not yet perceive. We found ourselves asking the same question over and over: what were they seeing that we are missing? The answer, when it came, did not emerge from our own observations in the field, but from a new perspective, one grounded not in biology, but in the local geology. It was my father who provided that perspective. A geologist by both profession and inclination, he joined the project midway through our research, bringing with him a way of seeing the landscape that differed fundamentally from our own. Where we had focused on what was visible, the grasses, the movement of the herd, the surface patterns, he was drawn to what lay beneath. To him, the land was not a uniform expanse, but a complex, layered system shaped over vast stretches of time. He began with soil sampling, taking cores from the very areas we had identified as significant. Then came geological mapping, charting the underlying strata, tracing the subtle shifts in composition that occurred beneath the surface. What he uncovered reframed everything we thought we understood. The land was not consistent. It was composed of distinct geological layers, each with its own properties, its own influence on the soil above. These layers dictated how water was retained or drained, how nutrients were distributed, how minerals accumulated. In turn, those factors determined which grasses could grow, how dense they would be, and what nutritional value they would offer. Suddenly, the patterns we had been observing were no longer mysterious. The grasses the Blessbach depended on were not simply present by chance, they were the direct expression of the geology beneath them. What we had perceived as subtle differences in vegetation were, in fact, the visible outcomes of deep, underlying structures, variations in rock, mineral content, and soil formation that stretched far below the surface. And the Blessbach, whether through instinct, adaptation, or something more complex, were responding to that hidden reality. They were not just selecting patches of grass. They were, in effect, selecting according to the underlying geology. The realization was both illuminating and sobering. It expanded our understanding of the ecosystem in a way that made it feel far more intricate and far more fragile than we had previously imagined. Relocation was no longer a matter of finding a place with similar grass. It meant replicating, as closely as possible, an entire geological and ecological system, something infinitely more complex and so much more difficult to achieve. The deeper we looked, the more the illusion of simplicity fell away. What we had initially understood as a relationship between animal and environment, one dependent, the other sustaining, revealed itself to be something far more dynamic, far more intertwined. The Blessbach were not merely shaped by their surroundings. They were actively shaping them in return. They were not passive inhabitants. They were architects. Their grazing, which at first seemed like a straightforward act of feeding, was in fact a form of subtle environmental engineering. By consistently cropping the grasses short, they prevented overgrowth and allowed sunlight to reach the soil surface, something taller, unmanaged grasses would have blocked. That exposure triggered new growth, younger shoots, denser clusters, and crucially, grasses with higher nutritional value. In feeding, they were cultivating. In consuming, they were renewing. And the cycle did not end there. Their droppings, scattered across the land in patterns that mirrored their movements, returned essential nutrients to the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, all reintroduced into the very ground that produced their food. It was a closed loop, elegant in its efficiency. The soil fed the grass fed the Blessbach, and the Blessbach, in turn, fed the soil. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was incidental. It was a system that regulated itself with a precision that no human intervention could easily replicate, balanced, resilient, and quietly astonishing in its design. But as intricate as that ecological cycle was, it was their behavior, their social structure and spatial awareness that revealed an entirely different layer of complexity. Over time, as the days in the field accumulated and the herd became familiar to us, certain individuals began to stand out. Subtle differences in posture, horn shape, movement, and slight variations in their coloring, details that at first blurred together, slowly resolved into distinct identities. Most striking among them were the territorial males. Unlike the main body of the herd, which moved fluidly across the landscape, these males occupied defined spaces along the periphery. Their territories were not marked by any physical barriers. There were no fences, no visible lines etched into the land. And yet, those boundaries existed, clearly, rigidly, and without ambiguity to those who recognized them. The markers were middens, carefully maintained piles of dung, placed and revisited with deliberate consistency. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, just another byproduct of the animal's presence. But the longer we observed, the clearer their purpose became. These were not random deposits. They were signals, territorial declarations, communication points, and boundary markers all in one. Each midden was both a message and a map. Initially, we misunderstood what we were seeing. When we approached too closely, the males would react abruptly, bolting into motion with a suddenness that suggested alarm. We assumed, naturally, that they were fleeing from us, but repeated observation began to challenge that assumption. Again and again, we saw the same pattern. The males would run, but not aimlessly, and not in retreat. Their movement had direction, intent. They were heading towards specific points, the middens, and when they reached one of them, they would pause, circle, or stand briefly, as though reasserting something invisible, yet vitally important. It wasn't fear, it was affirmation. They weren't escaping us, they were reinforcing their presence, anchoring themselves within boundaries that we could not yet perceive. So we decided to test it. using the data we had already gathered. Movement patterns, hidden locations, repeated pathways, we began to map out what we believed were territorial edges. It was meticulous work requiring patience and precision, but eventually, a pattern emerged, a network of overlapping domains, each centered around key midden sites. Then came the real test. We deliberately crossed those invisible lines. The reaction was immediate. The territorial male would snap to attention, his posture tightening, his focus locking onto us with unmistakable intensity. And then came the sound, a sharp, explosive alarm call, so sudden and forceful that it startled us every time. It resembled a sneeze, but carried far more weight, a clear, directed warning that we had crossed into a space that was not ours. There was no ambiguity in it, no hesitation. We had intruded. And yet, what happened next was even more revealing. The moment we stepped back, just a few paces, enough to move beyond the boundary we had only just begun to understand, the tension vanished. The male's posture softened. His gaze shifted. Almost immediately, he lowered his head and resumed grazing, as though the disturbance had never occurred. It was precise, repeatable, measurable, undeniably real. We were quite literally walking through invisible borders, lines drawn not on the land, but within a shared understanding among the animals themselves. Every now and then, a clash would occur between two territorial males. This normally started because one individual had encroached on the other's territory, either inadvertently or as a form of challenge. The defender would behave exactly the same way as when we stepped over the boundary, and sometimes a skirmish would ensue. However, these would not last very long, and were normally without injury, although there was one male which had a broken horn, presumably an aftereffect of one such conflict. By the time nearly a year had passed, our work had transformed from scattered observations into something tangible. We had data, detailed, layered, and consistent. We had maps that traced not just movement, but meaning. We had patterns that revealed the hidden structure of the ecosystem. More importantly, we had understanding not only of the blesbok as a species, but of the complex, interdependent system that sustained them. One aspect of our study that at first seemed somewhat insignificant, if not a little endearing, was that the blesbok appeared to be losing some of their instinctive fear and distrust of us humans. Apart from the two of us, there was only a handful of people on the farm. These included 4 workers that my dad employed to maintain the small quarry that he had opened, and then there was Lewis and his family that were permitted to graze a small herd of cattle. However, their movements were generally limited to the far side of the property, quite a distance away from where the herd resided. Another factor that had to be taken into consideration was the absence of predators on the farm. Apart from the blesbok, the only other wildlife present were duiker, steenbok, jackal, and the odd brown hyena that was a visitor from neighboring territory. Thus, if this particular herd were relocated anywhere in which predators were present, they would lack the natural flight response, which would make them easy targets, as is often the case with domestic livestock. When we presented our findings to the conservation group that had commissioned the study, the response was immediate and intense. What followed were weeks of rigorous discussion, long, often exhausting meetings filled with diagrams, projections, and careful debate. Every piece of data was examined, questioned, reevaluated. The stakes were too high for assumptions. Yet beneath the scrutiny, there was something else growing: cautious optimism. For the first time, the idea of relocation, once dismissed as nearly impossible, began to take on a fragile sense of feasibility. Eventually, those discussions moved to Johannesburg, where we spent an entire week refining what would become a working plan. It was ambitious, perhaps even precarious in its complexity, but it was grounded in everything we had learned. The approach was clear in principle, if daunting in execution. Identify a new site with geological characteristics that closely match the original habitat, confirm the presence, or potential restoration, of the specific grass species the blesbok depended on, and then carry out a carefully managed relocation before development could begin. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a chance. And for the first time since we had learned of the land's fate, that chance felt real. We returned to the farm carrying that fragile sense of purpose. We were exhausted, worn down by months of work and weeks of negotiation, but there was hope now, something steady enough to hold on to. We expected urgency, preparation, movement. The beginning of something difficult, but necessary. Instead, we found silence. An eerie, unnatural silence. There are moments in life when reality doesn't simply shift, it breaks. Cleanly, violently, without warning. In those moments, what you see refuses to align with what you know to be true. The mind searches for context, for explanation, for anything that might restore order, but nothing comes. Thought falters. Meaning collapses. This was one of those moments. At first, it was the stillness. Not the quiet we had come to know and understand, the gentle, breathing stillness of the felt, where life hums beneath the surface. But something else. Something wrong. The air felt heavy, suspended, as though the land itself were holding its breath. There were no distant movements, no shifting patterns, no low sounds of grazing or the soft rhythm of hooves pressing into earth. The absence was immediate, but not yet understood. Then slowly, shapes began to emerge. At the edge of perception at first, forms interrupting the natural flow of the grass. Too rigid, too numerous. The mind resisted assigning meaning to them, as if instinctively delaying the inevitable recognition. We kept walking, closer, each step tightening something unspoken between us. And finally, shockingly, it became clear. They were bodies. Not one, not a few, hundreds. They lay scattered across the felt in every direction, where we had once watched them move in fluid cohesion, where life had unfolded in rhythm and pattern. Now there was only disarray, limbs at unnatural angles, heads turned into the dust. The clean lines of muscle and motion we had studied so carefully reduced to stillness, so absolute it felt unreal. The miasmic stench of death confirmed it with terrible finality. One of these victims had been the territorial male, whose boundary was closest to the small cottage where we stayed. When we dared to go and inspect his remains, we were devastated to find him lying lifeless on top of one of his middens. It was clear that, instead of running away to save his life, he was more concerned about defending his territory, even to the point of death. The Bushveld, once alive with movement, with purpose, with a kind of quiet vitality, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A graveyard. The entire herd was gone. For a long moment, seconds, minutes, it's impossible to say. We stood there without speaking, without moving, caught in that fracture between seeing and understanding. The mind tried again and again to reject what the eyes insisted on accepting. This cannot be happening. This is wrong. This is not real. But sadly, unavoidably, reality refused to be ignored. Later, an eyewitness account would fill in the pieces we could not have imagined in that moment. A group of men had come onto the farm in 4x4 vehicles, fast, deliberate, purposeful. They carried automatic rifles. There had been no confusion, no hesitation. They moved through the land with efficiency, systematically gunning down the herd, males, females, young alike. There had been no attempt to spare, no effort to contain. It was not hunting, it was eradication. One key element that made these marauders' task so much easier was the very thing that we had overlooked. It was obvious that the Blessbach had only started fleeing once the carnage was properly underway, whereas, under normal circumstances, they would have done so immediately. Because they had become somewhat complacent about the presence of humans, their reaction was delayed. There are no adequate words for what we felt, standing there among them. Language feels insufficient in the face of something so total, so senseless. Shock came first, a numbing, hollowing force that stripped everything down to a single, suspended awareness. Then disbelief, clinging stubbornly even as the evidence lay all around us. And then something deeper began to take hold. Grief, yes, but not the quiet, reflective kind. This was heavier, sharper. It pressed inward, filled the chest, made breathing feel deliberate. It carried with it every moment we had spent with them, every observation, every pattern we had uncovered, every fragile hope we had allowed ourselves to build. And beneath it, threaded through it, was something colder. Rage, not wild or explosive, but focused, controlled. The kind that settles into the bones and stays there, clear and unwavering. We moved among them slowly, almost instinctively, as though searching for something that could not be found. A sign of life, a mistake, a single movement to contradict the finality of it all. There was none. At some point, we knelt beside one of them. I don't remember which. It didn't matter. In that moment, individuality blurred into something collective. The loss was too vast to separate into parts. The animal lay as if at rest, but there was no mistaking the stillness. The body that had once carried instinct, memory, and motion, everything we had come to understand so intimately, was empty. We had studied them, followed them, learned the hidden structures of their world, fought in our own way for their survival. And now they were gone, not by chance, not by drought or disease or the slow pressures of nature. They had been killed, deliberately, slaughtered without hesitation, without purpose that we could see, an entire system erased in a matter of moments. And standing there, surrounded by what remained, the full weight of that truth settled in, immovable, irreversible, and impossible to accept. These creatures, who had abandoned their instinctual mistrust of humans, had been mercilessly annihilated by the very beings they were supposed to fear. It didn't take long for the truth to begin surfacing, though when it did, it came not as a single revelation, but as a slow, tightening convergence of facts. At first, there were fragments, inconsistencies in timelines, uneasy silences in conversations, small details that didn't quite align. But as each piece fell into place, a clearer picture emerged, one that was as deliberate as it was devastating. It began, as so many such stories do, with conflict. The landowner, Reuben Mason, had not always stood alone. The farm, like the construction empire tied to it, had been built alongside his brother, Thomas. Together, they had founded Mason and Mason Construction, who had grown over the years into a multi-million-dollar company, known for its efficiency, its scale, and its ability to secure lucrative development contracts. On paper, they were partners. In practice, they had become something far more complicated. When the low-cost housing initiative was approved for the land, it was their company that secured the contract. It should have been a straightforward progression. Development following acquisition, progress measured in deadlines and deliverables. But there was one obstacle, one factor that did not fit neatly into schedules or budgets, the Blessbach. Reuben had insisted on delay. He understood, perhaps more than most, what the land held, not just in financial value, but in ecological significance. He wanted time for relocation, time for a solution that would preserve what could still be saved. It was not an easy stance to maintain, especially against mounting pressure, but he held it. Thomas did not. Where Reuben saw complexity, Thomas saw obstruction. Where one saw responsibility, the other saw risk, delays, rising costs, potential losses. And as the weeks stretched into months, and it became increasingly clear that relocating the herd was far more complicated than initially believed, that tension hardened into impatience, then into resolve. What followed was not impulsive. It was not chaotic or poorly conceived. It was in its own way methodical, quietly arranged, efficiently executed, and entirely devoid of conscience. Without consultation, without disclosure, Thomas made a decision. He identified the herd not as a living system, not as something worthy of preservation, but as a problem. And problems in his world were removed. He hired gunmen. There was no spectacle to it, no public acknowledgement, no trace left that could not be denied. At least, that was the intention. The act itself was swift, brutal, and absolute. In a matter of hours, what had taken generations to evolve was reduced to silence. And just like that, an entire ecosystem was erased. But in that calculated act, in the precision with which it had been carried out, there was one critical misjudgment. They had underestimated us. Grief did not paralyze us. It sharpened us. Where once we had observed with curiosity and care, we now worked with focus and intent. We documented everything, every body where it lay, every wound that spoke of violence rather than chance, every detail that resisted explanation. The felt became, once again, a field of study, but now it was evidence we were gathering, not data. We mapped the positions of the fallen as carefully as we had once mapped grazing patterns. We photographed injuries, noting trajectories, clustering, the unmistakable signatures of automatic gunfire. We recorded time frames, environmental conditions, anything that could anchor the event in verifiable reality. There would be no ambiguity, no room for dismissal or doubt. The same discipline that had allowed us to understand the herd now became the foundation for holding someone accountable for its destruction. When we brought our findings to the conservation group, the response was immediate and decisive. What had begun as a research initiative transformed into something far more urgent. Wildlife authorities were contacted. Law enforcement was brought in. What followed was not a symbolic inquiry, but a full-scale investigation, and it did not relent. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced. Communications were traced, calls made, messages, instructions that pointed beyond coincidence. Contracts were uncovered, linking individuals to actions that could no longer be obscured. Financial records revealed transactions that aligned too closely with the timeline of a massacre to be ignored. Each thread, when followed, led back to the same origin, Thomas Mason. The case moved to court, and with it, our role shifted once more. We were no longer researchers, no longer observers standing at a distance. We became witnesses. Standing in that courtroom, the distance between the felt and the law collapsed into something immediate and tangible. We spoke not only of what we had found, but of what we had come to understand, the complexity of the system that had been destroyed, the impossibility of replacing it, the deliberate nature of its eradication. We gave voice, in whatever way we could, to something that could no longer speak for itself. We told their story. The verdict, when it came, was clear and unequivocal. The gunmen were convicted, held accountable for their direct role in the slaughter. And Thomas Mason, the architect behind it, faced severe legal consequences. The penalties imposed reflected, at least in part, the magnitude of what had been lost, not just in terms of wildlife, but in the destruction of an entire ecological system. It was not justice in any complete sense. There is no verdict that can restore a living system once it has been erased. No sentence that can return movement to a silent landscape. But it mattered. It established truth. It drew a line. It said in no uncertain terms that this was not acceptable, that such acts would not pass without consequence. And life, in its relentless way, continued. The housing project moved forward, as it had always been intended to. Another contractor took over. Foundations were laid. Structures rose where once the herd had moved freely. Progress, as it is so often defined, resumed its course. For a time, we remained caught between what had been and what now lay ahead, between grief and the slow, difficult process of moving beyond it. But grief, if it is not allowed to fade into silence, can become something else. Purpose. In the months that followed, we turned outward. What had happened could not be undone, but it could be spoken about, learned from, used to challenge the systems that had allowed it to occur. We became advocates, pushing for stronger protections, clearer regulations, accountability, where it had once been absent. We spoke to anyone who would listen, and to many who would not, because stories like this have a way of repeating themselves, unless they are made impossible to ignore. The Blesbach herd was gone, but their story was not. And as long as it was told fully, truthfully, without softening its edges, something of them remained. We are no longer in the field in the way we once were, although we do return to it whenever the opportunity arises. There was a time when our days were measured in distances walked, in hours spent beneath an open sky, in the slow accumulation of observation and understanding. The felt was our workspace, our classroom, our constant point of reference. Everything we learned came through presence, through watching, waiting, and allowing the land to reveal itself on its own terms. That life feels distant now, not abandoned but transformed. Our work did not end. It changed shape, shifted direction, evolved into something we had not anticipated but in some ways had been moving toward all along. The loss we witnessed did not push us away from a natural world. It altered how we engage with it. Where once we studied and recorded, we now interpret and translate. Where once we gathered data, we now carry stories. I paint. At first, it began almost instinctively, an attempt to process what cannot be ordered into notes or reports. There are things that resist language, the exact quality of light on a moving herd, the tension in stillness before flight, the weight of absence where life once existed. Paint became a way to reach toward those things, to hold them for a moment, to give them form without reducing them. I find myself returning again and again to the same subjects, not to recreate them exactly, but to understand them differently each time. Movement, pattern, space, loss, presence is not documentation, it is remembrance. Sion writes, "Where I work in color and form, she works in language, but not in the clinical, structured way we once did." Her writing moves through the spaces we used to overlook, the silences between events, the emotional contours of what we experience, the human weight carried alongside the ecological. She gives shape to what lingers, what cannot be measured but is no less real. Through her words, the absence left behind becomes something that can be felt, confronted, understood. Together we tell stories, not just of what happened to that herd, but of what it represents. Of species standing on the edge of disappearance, their survival balanced on decisions made far from where they live. Of ecosystems that appear resilient until suddenly they are not. Of connections so intricate and so essential that they remain invisible until they are broken. We speak of these things wherever we can, through exhibitions, through publications, through conversations that begin quietly and sometimes grow into something larger. We try in whatever way is possible to make people see, not just the animals, but the systems they belong to, the dependencies that sustain them, the consequences of ignoring them. Because once you truly see those connections, you cannot unsee them. And everything we do, every painting, every piece of writing, every story we share, traces back to that herd, to what we learned in their presence, that life is not isolated, but interwoven in ways both visible and hidden. To what we uncovered beneath the surface, that even the ground itself plays a role in shaping existence. And unavoidably to what we lost, not just a group of animals, but an entire living system, extinguished in a moment of calculated disregard. Their lives were taken needlessly, erased in the name of progress, efficiency, profit. Words that in isolation sound reasonable, necessary even, but when measured against what they cost, they take on a different weight. Yet their existence, the quiet, intricate role they played in the world, cannot be undone so easily. It remains. It lives on in what we came to understand, in what we now carry forward, in the way it has reshaped how we see and speak and act. It exists in every effort to prevent such a loss from happening again, in every moment where awareness interrupts indifference. And in that, there is something enduring, something that does not fade with time or distance. Something that refuses to disappear. If you enjoyed this tale, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. It would mean the world to us.